In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at one of the most exciting, underrated watch brands, in my opinion. And we're doing it all the way from here in one of the most beautiful places in the world, the Isle of Harris in Scotland. Stories. We all spend our lives telling them. They're the only thing in my mind that can withstand the test of time. No matter where I go or who I speak to, everyone has a story to tell. But the important thing to me is to capture that story. You know, throughout my career as a photographer and videographer, I've always tried to capture moments through pictures, but more recently, savor those moments through watches. Time's a funny old thing, isn't it? As I get older and a little wiser, I understand its incredible value and the real need to keep track of it. Whether it's a frame you're saving or time you're tracking, it's great to have a companion with you to share those moments with. And that, well, that's where Leica comes in. Welcome back to the Chisholm Hunter channel. My name is Harrison, as always. And you know, when a brand is so successful in one area, in one niche, it's very difficult for them to hop over to another because people naturally put things in boxes. They put things in one section. But this brand, I feel, has made the dive into something new in a pretty unbelievable fashion. Right, so back in 2018, Leica announced that they would be stepping into the luxury watch world. And fast forward 7 years to 2025, and they've made some pretty unbelievable pieces. Okay, so to make this easy, let's split it into 3 sections. Firstly, let's cover the history of Leica watches. Then after that, let's cover the specs and the watches. And then after that, we're going to be covering some pretty incredible details that you're not going to want to miss. The history of Leica is actually pretty special because it starts in the same world as watchmaking. Ernest Leitz trained as a fine mechanic in Switzerland, right in the heart of horology. Before he returned to Wetzlar, where he and his son teamed up with engineer Oscar Barnick, and together they applied the same kind of micro-engineering precision that you'd find in a movement, but to cameras instead. The result? They changed photography literally forever. Leica made cameras smaller, lighter, faster, and with optics that could finally keep up with real life. So essentially what Leica did is they stripped away the long shutter speed times. So, you know back in the day how everyone used to kind of look like this, and they'd just be kind of miserable, and they'd go, and that was the photo. It's because the shutter speed was on a really long shutter speed, so they had to stay still for a really long time. But Leica kind of changed the game and then allowed people to capture a moment in real time. The Leica 1 was launched in 1925 and was born from the same mindset of timing, accuracy, and craftsmanship learned from watchmaking. It allowed photographers to capture spontaneous, authentic moments instead of the weird kind of pose stuff that we just talked about. And now Leica has come full circle. And in 2022, they brought the same mechanical artistry that they used in their cameras back to the wrist with the ZM1 and the ZM2. These are watches that echo the design language of iconic Leica M cameras. It's kind of a perfect loop when you think about it. The precision of timekeeping inspiring the art of photography, and now photography inspiring the craft of time. Okay, so that's a little bit about the history, but now we get to the really exciting bit for us watch guys. We get to dive in headfirst to these watches. But before we do that, let's go somewhere a little bit warmer because it's cold. All right, everybody, so we came somewhere a little bit, I say warmer, it's not exactly warm, but it's more doable, let's say. So let's talk about the watches. Firstly, we're going to dive into the ZM11 and the ZM12. So the ZM11 and 12 are the more modern, design-focused models. You can really see some futuristic stuff coming through here, but let's cover the specs really quick. The ZM11 comes in at 41 millimeters in diameter. It does look quite chunky because it doesn't really have a bezel, and it comes in at 13 millimeters in thickness. Now, there are a couple of variants that you can choose between when looking at the ZM11. You have stainless steel, you have grade 5 titanium. These watches are water resistant to 100 meters, have a sapphire case back and front. They have a black and red dial, a golden brown dial, and also a sunburst blue dial. The movement in these models is the Leica LA3001. This is a Chronode C102 base, and it's fully automatic with 60 hours of power. And now we move on to the ZM12, which actually just so happens to be the one that I've got on the wrist today. The ZM12 has slightly more attractive proportions in my personal opinion. It comes in at 39mm in case diameter, 13mm in thickness again. It comes in stainless steel or grade 5 titanium. It's water resistant again to 100 meters. Has a dual layer dial, which is absolutely stunning in the light. I mean, when you move this dial, you can really see the kind of depth of it and the colors running through it. It's really quite stunning. It has the choice between a fabric strap, rubber strap, or integrated bracelet in steel or titanium. And the movement on this model is the caliber LA-3002, and it was made in collaboration with Chronode, and it has 60 hours of power. When we look at these watches side by side, we can actually see that they're extremely similar. I mean, the ZM12 strips away the date window for a small seconds at the 6 o'clock mark, and the ZM11 is that slight bit bigger. But apart from that, they're extremely similar. I do think the ZM12 is slightly more attractive to me, personally, but I don't think it's the most attractive watch that they have in the range, personally speaking. So let's move on to my favorite watches that Leica produce. So these are the ZM1s and the ZM2s. Now, I actually don't have the ZM1, but I do have the ZM2, and I have to say, it's my favorite watch that Leica have ever produced. So let's talk about the specs a little bit. These watches come in at 41mm in diameter, 14.5mm in thickness. They come in stainless steel. Now, yes, that is quite thick, but it's partially because of that domed sapphire crystal glass on the front, which is kind of reminiscent of typical, I've got one right here, of a Leica camera lens. There's a couple of different variants of both the ZM1 and the ZM2 to choose between, so I'll put them up on the screen at the moment. The ZM2 has 50 meters of water resistance, the Leica movement LH1001, and that's fully manual with 26 joules, and it has a frequency of 28,800 VPH. It has 60 hours of power, and it has hour functions, minute functions, seconds, date, power reserve indicator, a second time zone, and it has a black calf leather strap. What's really impressive about the ZM2 though is when you flip this watch around to reveal that movement. It is absolutely jaw-droppingly gorgeous. Now, an interesting fact about the movements of these Leica watches is apart from the sapphire crystal and the strap, so the leather strap that you see, 95% of the movement is produced entirely in-house. And that is extremely rare when it comes to watches. When it comes to watch brands, they take little components from here, little components from there, and put it together and say that it's an in-house movement, when realistically it's not. But something that is tried and tested, is 95% produced in-house, is pretty incredible in the watch industry. The dial on this watch is in black. There's a ton of the cool details that we'll move on to in a second that I'll talk about. And it does have a brilliant splash of red on that second track that you can see the 6 o'clock mark in the hand there. Now, if you look at the right-hand side where the pusher is, the crown is, you can see that it also has a red crown, which is pretty awesome. Actually, when we look at the ZM12 and the ZM11, just like the lens release of a Leica camera, that's what the function is at the bottom here that takes off the bracelet. It's super easy and actually looks, I'm actually going to say this, and it's quite a strong statement, especially for me who kind of works alongside a lot of watches. The quick release function on the back of these watches is one of the best I've seen in the watch industry. Often it's an afterthought in the watch industry because you don't see it, right? People don't actively flip their watches around to look at that part of the watch. But here it feels premium, it feels smooth. It doesn't feel like you're pinching two tiny components together and they ping across the floor. It's smooth, it's well thought out, it's well constructed. Now, there is a ton of cool details when it comes to both of these watches, so we're gonna move on to that just in a moment, but we need to move out of this area because the wind is horrendous. Okay guys, so we've just reached a bothy, the secret bothy up in Lewis. It was actually quite a pain in the arse to find, and it's stunning. It sits on the edge of these beautiful cliffs, these sheer drops. My fear of heights has definitely been ignited, but let's talk about a couple of cool features on the ZM2. So when we look at the ZM2, we can see that it's not really your typical watch. At the top right-hand side, you do have a pusher, but it's not your typical pusher. When you push this, it resets the date. It flicks through the date wheel. Now, in my other watches that I do have, specifically my Seamaster, and I've said this in other videos, I fell out of love with the date window just because you need to unwind the crown and then you pull it out, and then because you pulled it out too far, you accidentally change the time and then you push it back in. It's just a bit of a nightmare. But having this at the push of a button makes it a lot easier. Taking a step down from that on the crown, we can see that it has a little red dot here, and this is actually a push crown mechanism. So what this does is it actually resets the seconds. It stops the seconds, and it also changes a bit of the dial. So you can see that at the moment, just beside the hands, just below the Leica logo, there's a white dot. When you push that crown, it goes red and resets the seconds, and then what you can do is reset the time from there. Now if I push that crown again, it goes white, and I can wind the watch, but it doesn't reset the time. And overall, what this does is makes setting the time more accurate. If you can think of setting the time on other watches, typically speaking, you can't really control the seconds, and not always, but typically. So this actually makes it more accurate, plus it's patented. Then moving on to the left-hand side, around about the 9 o'clock mark, or sandwiched in between the 9 o'clock mark and the 8 o'clock mark, you can see a power reserve window. As you wind this, two black discs separate, and it turns white. And that essentially means that you've got power in your watch. And that's how you know you've wound it fully or not wound it enough. And it's kind of reminiscent of a Leica camera. And then finally on the bottom you have an interior rotating bezel which allows you GMT functionality. Now what GMT functionality does is essentially means you can read multiple time zones at the one time. Now as a photographer and videographer, that's really, really important. I travel a lot, as I'm sure that a lot of you guys do, and having GMT functionality allows you to not call mum at 3 in the morning by accident. And now we get to those super cool details on both the ZM11, the ZM12, and the ZM1 and the ZM2. So the ZM11 and 12 are actually designed by Marcus Ellinger, and he's known for the IWC Big Pilot, the Zenith Chronomaster, the H. Moser, and Psi Streamliner. So he's designed some pretty iconic watches, and he's very, very well respected in the industry. Now, the bracelet that he's designed on the ZM11 isn't really for me, I'm going to be totally honest, but the future innovation and the forward-thinking nature is really, really cool, and he's very, very well respected in the industry. Next up, we have the dial detail on these two watches. So the dial detail is very detailed. I mean, it's a dual layered dial, and let me just talk about that for a second because it's awesome. These dials are crafted over 2 weeks with 30 steps. It creates depth and kind of an interplay of light, reminiscing the way light hits a camera shutter during exposure. And then finally on these watches we have the easy chain strap, and I've kind of already covered them, but it was one of the best interchangeable strap systems that I've used, period, which is kind of a big deal. And now we move on to the ZM1 and the ZM2, which I've kind of covered, but let me just cover some of the really cool details that stood out to me. So firstly, as we said, the push crown has actually been patented, and it does make changing the time a lot more accurate and a lot easier. Then we have the power reserve indicator, which we looked at, and it's basically two closing shutters that display the remaining 60 hours of power, and it's reminiscent of the cameras, which I love. Then we have the ZM2 exclusive GMT functionality with the day and night indicator, and it's operated via that crown. Moving away from the watches, let's cover cool stuff about the collaborators that helped on these watch designs. So firstly, we have Achim Heine, and he actually is a Leica camera designer. Then we have Andreas Strella, and he's a master watchmaker in movement design. Then we have Reinhard Meiss, who's an absolute legend in the industry, and he actually used to work for a Langenzanner. He's the guy that actually designed the Leica's patented push crown mechanism. And now we finally get to the conclusion and the price. So what I'm going to do is put all the models above right now, just above my head or even on the screen at the moment, and you can see the individual price. Now there's a lot of polarization when it comes to Leica cameras and also Leica watches, and I can actually understand the struggle of trying to navigate through what you're commonly known for. Everybody knows Leica as a camera manufacturer, so if they step away from that, there's obviously going to be some polarization where people say, well, they shouldn't do that. And I can kind of understand that. Now, are all these watches for me? I wouldn't say so. I think the ZM11 and ZM12 are a little bit too futuristic looking for me. I definitely side with the ZM2. I think that's my personal favorite, but it's not my job to tell you guys what you should like. It's my job to just educate you on what's there. I do think that Leica watches are quite heavily underrated, especially when you look at the innovation that's going into all of them. And they are a very young brand. They've got a very, very long way to go. But come on, some of this stuff that's in the ZM2 specifically is really cool. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these watches. Which is your favorite Leica watch? Thank you guys so much for watching this little cinematic piece from Scotland. We're gonna go and get some food now because it's absolutely freezing. And I'll see you guys real soon.